Every history teacher on the planet will tell you the Vikings were the greatest sailors of the ancient world. They crossed the Atlantic in wooden ships. They reached North America centuries before Columbus. They raided coastlines from England to Constantinople. And none of that is wrong. But what if I told you there was a civilization that was sailing the open ocean, hunting deep-sea predators, and navigating without any landmarks visible on the horizon a full 40,000 years before a single Viking longship ever touched water? Not 400 years before. Not 4,000. 40,000. And almost nobody in the Western world has ever heard their story. By the time this video is over, you will never look at a world history textbook the same way again. Let me give the Vikings their due, because they absolutely earned respect. From roughly the 8th century to the 11th century CE, Norse seafarers dominated the waters of Europe and beyond. Their longships were genuinely brilliant pieces of engineering. The clinker construction method, where overlapping planks were riveted together with iron nails, created hulls that could flex with ocean waves rather than crack under pressure. These ships drew as little as half a meter of water, which meant Vikings could sail straight up rivers, land on beaches, and launch surprise attacks on inland cities that thought they were safe from naval threats. A typical longship carried between 40 and 80 warriors along with supplies. They could be rowed when the wind died. They could be carried overland between river systems. Vikings used these ships to establish trade routes stretching from Scandinavia to Baghdad. They colonized Iceland. They settled Greenland. Leif Erikson and his crew set foot on North American soil around the year 1000 CE. By every conventional measure, Viking maritime achievement is extraordinary and deserves its place in history. But here is what conventional history leaves out. When we zoom out from Europe and look at the full span of human maritime activity across the entire planet, the Viking Age is not the beginning of ocean mastery. It is closer to the end, and the civilization that rewrites this timeline is not one most people would guess. It is the ancient peoples of the Philippine archipelago. In the last few years, a series of archaeological discoveries have fundamentally altered our understanding of when humans first became true ocean voyagers. Researchers working across multiple dig sites in the Philippines have uncovered evidence that the people living on those islands developed advanced cordage technology, meaning rope and fiber binding, at least 40,000 years ago. Now you might hear the word rope and think that sounds mundane, but rope is the foundational technology of all shipbuilding. You cannot construct a vessel capable of surviving the open ocean without strong, reliable cordage. You need it to bind hull planks together. You need it to rig sails. You need it to create nets for fishing. You need it to lash outrigger floats to the main hull. You need it to secure cargo so it does not shift and capsize your boat in heavy seas. Rope is not a minor detail. It is the technology that makes every other maritime technology possible. And these ancient Filipinos had it during the Stone Age, tens of thousands of years before metallurgy, before written language, before agriculture, before the construction of the first Egyptian pyramid. Consider the geographical reality of the Philippines. The archipelago consists of over 7,000 islands. And here is the critical fact that many people do not realize. These islands were never connected to each other by continuous land bridges, not even during the most extreme glacial periods when global sea levels dropped by over 100 meters. There were some partial connections to mainland Asia through what is now called Sundaland, but the islands themselves, particularly those in the central and eastern Philippines, remained separated by deep ocean channels throughout the entire Pleistocene. So when archaeologists find evidence of human habitation on these islands dating back 40,000, 50,000, even 67,000 years in the case of the Callao cave discoveries on Luzon, there is only one possible explanation. Those people got there by boat. They crossed the open ocean. They did it repeatedly and successfully enough to establish permanent populations. And they did this during an era when our European ancestors were still primarily focused on terrestrial survival, hunting mammoths and gathering plants on continuous landmasses where ocean navigation was simply not a necessity. Now let me take this further, because the evidence does not stop at mere island hopping. Archaeological analysis of food remains found at sites throughout the Philippines reveals something stunning. By roughly 35,000 years ago, the people living on these islands were engaged in deep-sea fishing. We are not talking about wading into shallow water and spearing fish near the shore. We are talking about catching pelagic species, open ocean fish like tuna, and various species of shark, animals that live far from coastlines in deep water. Catching a tuna or a shark from a boat 35,000 years ago requires a level of maritime capability that is almost difficult to comprehend. Your vessel has to be stable enough to operate in open ocean swells far from the shelter of any coastline. It has to be strong enough to handle the violent thrashing of a large predatory fish being hauled alongside or into the boat. It has to be reliable enough that the fishermen trust it with their lives, because if your boat fails in deep water 35,000 years ago, there is no rescue, there is no radio, there is no second chance. You are simply gone. The fact that these ancient Filipinos were routinely doing this tells us their boat-building technology was not primitive. It was remarkably sophisticated for its era. They had solved engineering problems that European civilizations would not even encounter for another 30 millennia. Let me put a timeline comparison in front of you, so the scale of this really sinks in. 40,000 years ago, ancient Filipinos are building seaworthy vessels and crossing open ocean channels. 35,000 years ago, they are deep-sea fishing for tuna and sharks. Around 25,000 years ago, their descendants and related Austronesian peoples are continuing to refine maritime technology across island Southeast Asia. Around 5,000 years ago, the Austronesian expansion begins, and people from this region launch what becomes the single greatest maritime migration in human history, eventually colonizing islands from Madagascar off the coast of Africa all the way to Easter Island in the remote Eastern Pacific and New Zealand in the south. They covered more than half the circumference of the Earth using boats built without a single metal fastener. They navigated using stars, ocean swells, bird flight patterns, and cloud formations over water. And then, around 800 CE, the Viking Age begins. I am not saying this to diminish the Vikings. I am saying this to provide accurate historical context that our education systems have consistently failed to deliver. Let me talk about the vessels themselves, because the engineering is genuinely fascinating. The boat-building tradition of the Philippines produced a vessel type known as the Balangai, sometimes spelled Balangai. Several of these boats have been excavated from burial sites near the city of Butuan in the southern Philippines, and they have been radiocarbon dated to as early as the 4th century CE, which means they predate the Viking Age by roughly 500 years. But the Balangai represents a mature technology, not a new invention. The design principles behind it, the outrigger system, the sewn plank construction, the multi-hull stability concept, these are technologies that evolved over thousands of years of continuous maritime culture. A Balangai recovered from Butuan measured approximately 15 meters in length. It could carry around 30 people along with trade goods. The hull was constructed from carved wooden planks that were stitched together using fibers derived from plants, specifically various palm and abaca fibers that were processed into incredibly strong cordage. No iron nails, no metal fasteners of any kind. Wooden dowels and fiber lashing held the entire structure together. And it worked. These boats sailed across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean, connecting trade networks that spanned from China to Indonesia. The outrigger design deserves special attention because it represents one of the most important naval engineering innovations in human history, and it came from this region. An outrigger is a secondary float attached to the main hull by lateral beams. It provides extraordinary lateral stability, which means the boat resists capsizing even in rough seas and high winds. This design is so effective that it's spread across the entire Pacific and Indian Ocean regions, and modern racing sailboats and even some military vessels use variations of the same principle today. Filipino and broader Austronesian boat builders did not just stumble upon this concept. They refined it over generations into multiple configurations: single outrigger, double outrigger, and eventually full double-hull catamarans. Each variation served different purposes, from coastal fishing to long-distance ocean voyaging to warfare. By contrast, Viking longships, as impressive as they were, used a single-hull monoplane design. They were fast and shallow-drafted, which made them perfect for European rivers and coastal raiding, but they were not optimized for the kind of deep ocean crossings that Austronesian vessels routinely performed across the vast Pacific. There is another dimension to this story that rarely gets discussed, and that is navigation. Vikings navigated using coastal landmarks, sun compasses, and possibly sunstones, which are calcite crystals that can detect the sun's position through clouds. These were effective tools for crossing the North Atlantic, where the distances between Iceland, Greenland, and North America, while significant, are relatively short compared to Pacific Ocean crossings. Austronesian navigators, the descendants of those ancient Filipino seafarers, developed a navigation system of almost unbelievable sophistication. They memorized star maps. They read ocean swell patterns, detecting the subtle ways that distant islands refracted wave energy. They observed the behavior of seabirds, knowing which species ventured far from land and which stayed close. They watched for specific cloud formations that form over islands due to differential heating of land and water. They could detect the presence of an island hundreds of kilometers away by reading the color of the ocean, the pattern of debris floating on the surface, and the phosphorescent glow of certain marine organisms disturbed by island-reflected currents. This was not guesswork. This was a rigorous, systematic body of knowledge passed down through oral tradition across hundreds of generations. Western scientists did not fully understand or appreciate this navigation system until the 20th century, when researchers like David Lewis and Ben Finney began documenting the techniques of surviving traditional navigators in Polynesia and Micronesia. So why does almost nobody in the Western world know about this? Why do we learn about Viking longships in school, but not about Balangai vessels? Why do we celebrate Norse exploration, but barely mention the Austronesian expansion, which covered more distance, involved more people, and lasted thousands of years longer? The answer is unfortunately rooted in the biases of how history has been written and taught. Modern historical scholarship developed primarily in European academic institutions during the 18th and 19th centuries, a period when European colonial powers, including Spain, which colonized the Philippines for over 300 years, had strong incentives to portray non-European peoples as primitive and incapable of major achievement. The Spanish colonial narrative about the Philippines specifically emphasized the idea that Filipinos were uncivilized before Spanish arrival, a claim that was useful for justifying colonization, but is completely contradicted by the archaeological evidence. Pre-colonial Filipino societies had written scripts, complex legal codes, extensive international trade networks, metallurgy, textile production, and maritime technology that was among the most advanced in the world. But acknowledging that would have undermined the entire ideological framework of colonialism, so those achievements were systematically minimized or erased from the historical record as it was taught in Western institutions. The good news is that this is changing. In the last 2 decades, a wave of new archaeological research, much of it led by Filipino and Southeast Asian scholars, has been revealing the true depth and sophistication of ancient Filipino maritime culture. The Butuan boat excavations, ongoing cave archaeology across the archipelago, genetic studies tracing migration patterns, and linguistic analysis of Austronesian language dispersal have all contributed to a much more complete and accurate picture. In 2011, a team of Filipino sailors actually built a replica Balangai and sailed it from the Philippines to Borneo, a journey of hundreds of kilometers across open sea, proving that the vessel design was absolutely capable of the long-distance voyaging that the archaeological evidence suggested. The replica was built using traditional methods, no metal fasteners, only wooden pegs and plant fiber rope. And it performed beautifully. Let me bring this back to the core comparison one more time. The Viking Age lasted roughly 300 years. The ancient Filipino and broader Austronesian maritime tradition spans over 40,000 years. Vikings crossed the North Atlantic, a distance of roughly 3,000 kilometers at its widest relevant point. Austronesian sailors crossed the Pacific Ocean, which is over 15,000 kilometers wide. Vikings used iron tools, established trade networks, and built upon centuries of Mediterranean and Northern European maritime knowledge. Ancient Filipinos began their maritime journey during the Stone Age with no metal, no written knowledge, and no contact with other seafaring civilizations to learn from. Vikings reached a few locations in North America and established settlements that ultimately failed. Austronesian peoples permanently colonized every habitable island in the Pacific Ocean, settled Madagascar off the coast of Africa, and created a cultural and genetic legacy that today connects over 400 million people across half the globe. None of this means Vikings were not impressive. They absolutely were. Their longships were masterpieces of medieval European engineering. Their exploration of the North Atlantic was genuinely brave and consequential. Their cultural impact on European history is enormous and well documented. But the greatest sailors in history? When you look at the full evidence, that title belongs elsewhere. It belongs to the descendants of those ancient people who looked out at the vast and terrifying ocean surrounding their islands 40,000 years ago and decided to build boats and cross it. Not because they had advanced technology, not because they had metal tools or written navigation charts, but because they had ingenuity, courage, and a relationship with the sea so deep and so old that it predates almost everything else in human civilization. If this video changed the way you think about history, I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We are dedicated to telling the stories that mainstream education has overlooked, suppressed, or simply never bothered to research. Every week, we go deep into the real history of civilizations that changed the world but never received the recognition they deserve. Drop a comment below and tell me what surprised you most. Tell me which ancient civilization you think we should investigate next. Your suggestions directly influence what we cover. Share this video with someone who still thinks Vikings were the greatest sailors in history. Let them see the evidence. And if you want to go even deeper into the maritime history of the ancient world, check out the video on screen right now. I will see you there.